Well, hey there, this is Cindy, and thanks so much for joining us today. But before we dive in, I wanted to share some different ways that we can work together if you're looking to uplevel your negotiation skills. I offer everything from online to my signature one-on-one mastermind to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. So if that sounds interesting, check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com. But now onto today's program and the reason that you are here. Really happy to introduce you to Jessica Fialkovich today. We're going to be talking about how to negotiate the effective sale of your business. And I'm looking forward to this. I got a pad and pen ready. I'm ready to take notes. So welcome, Jessica. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's great to be here. I'm excited to be on the show today.
Yeah, it's such an interesting niche you've chosen. So for any of our listeners or viewers out there, if you don't know Jessica Fialkovich, she's an exit expert. That's a bit of a tongue twister there, an exit expert. It's a great little niche. I think it's so important and so often overlooked. She's also a best-selling author, speaker, small business advocate. She's an award-winning business owner, no less, and the founder of Exit Factor and co-owner of Transworld Business Advisors. So definitely she's been an entrepreneur at heart. You're going to hear a little bit more about that, and successfully built and sold 2 startups. And her husband through Transworld run the business brokerage firm that does most of the M&A transactions annually for small and medium-sized businesses. So Jessica definitely comes to you with some chops and expertise in this area. And I knew when I found out that Jessica was a Jersey girl at heart and a Springsteen fan, I knew I'd like her and had to have her on the show. So, so Jessica, I know that you're an entrepreneur at heart and you became, I think, a first-time entrepreneur at only 25 years old. So tell us about your start onto this line of work.
Yeah, so I did not think I was going to be an entrepreneur when I was growing up.
Yeah.
My parents were in education and nursing, respectively, but my grandparents were entrepreneurs. So, like, there was a little bit of a bug. But when I went into the workforce, I graduated college in 2005. So, I had a few really good years, and then we hit the massive recession. So, it was a change of mindset, I'd say, for me, where I had been really coached my whole life that if I got a good job for a good company and I worked hard, I would be safe, right? I'd be protected. And that just wasn't the case. So getting laid off in the midst of the 0809 recession really taught me that the only one that really can control my future and be responsible for my future is me.
Mm.
And so that was my start into entrepreneurship. My husband, he was my boyfriend at the time, and I were drinking a lot of wine. So we just had this brilliant idea to start a wine company, and it kind of grew off and running. But that was my start into entrepreneurship. It was not the path I thought I would have chose when I was leaving university.
Yeah, and I love that idea about that controlling the things that we can control in life, right? Because certainly the old school conditioning was the opposite. You know, people found an employer, you stayed with that employer until retirement, ideally. And it is a whole different landscape out there today, even pre-COVID, and now even more so. We're seeing such massive shifts. Now, I know as
Right.
founder of Exit Factor, you teach business owners how to, buy and sell businesses to get the most profit in the least amount of time. And I always say that the first and most important negotiation is the one with ourselves, negotiating our mindset. So I know for a lot of business owners, their business is their baby, right? So I'd love if
Mhm.
you could share some strategies or how you help people address the mindset issues that come up when you're looking at selling a business.
Yeah. And you're totally right, Cindy. There's lots of mindset issues. And actually, my whole metaphor throughout my entire book is your business is not your baby. Right.
Good.
So to pick up on that. And I get it. Look, I've built companies too, and they felt like my baby at times. I mean, sometimes I have a 10-month-old right now and can tell you firsthand that my business takes more time and effort than my actual baby does. So, some days. But I think that the first thing is that it's the reality that we will all exit our businesses. Like, we will all leave our businesses. And really, the decision that you have to make is whether you want to control that exit and get something out of it, whether that means you're taking cash out of the business, selling the business, maybe transitioning it to a next generation,
Yeah.
or you want to leave that whole process up to fate. And unfortunately, and this is the message, this is why I do these podcasts, the message I'm trying to get out there is most entrepreneurs take what I call the flamingo strategy, right? They put their head in the sand and they say, I'll think about my exit next year or 5 years from now or when I'm ready. And they never get around to actually addressing what that exit strategy or plan is. And because of that, 87% of all businesses in the US close their doors.
Yeah.
Only 3% are able to sell and transition.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. I confess I've been guilty of that as well, because I spent 30 years building a law practice. And when I was making that shift to women on purpose and really building that, I was kind of left because I'd had no exit strategy in place. And, you don't want to let go of something that you spent 30 years building without getting something out. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. So why don't we jump right in with some sort of practical how-to maybe advice? So most business experts teach how to start a business, how to grow a business, but we're frankly rarely taught, how to sell or how to exit a business. So I know you're the author of the #1 best-selling book, Getting the Most for Selling Your Business. What are some of the top tips that you'd recommend?
Well, so first is kind of what we talked is really to have some options for yourself. So like we all know, we put these perfect plans in place, and I might be the only one this happens to, but my plans never go according to my plan, right? There's always
Definitely not the only one, Jessica.
no, yeah, there's bumps and things change. And so identifying a number of options that you have in place. Like a lot of my colleagues will say you need this structured exit plan, whereas I'm more a fan of options. So what is your option A? Maybe your option A is to sell the company. And then your backup option might be to transition it to employees, or maybe to do a structured closing of the doors, but making sure you get the most cash out of that through inventory reduction and things like that. So that's the first step, is really knowing what your options are and having those laid out and a plan that you can execute at any time. So most exits come because of a personal reason in our lives. We have a change in priorities. We might need to relocate. There could be health issues. So really being able to execute on those at any time. Yeah. So that's the first one. The second one is all about the financial
Before you
health.
jump into the second one, because something just struck me when you said about it for personal reasons. So do you suggest that people have these plans in place even when they're not considering exiting the business, like doing this in advance, so that if something comes up, you've got options ready? What's your advice on that?
Yes, definitely all the time. So we've done over 600 deals in our business brokerage and M&A practice. And I can say about 95% of those were not planned exits. They were exits that something came up. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes it's something negative. Sometimes it's illness. Sometimes it's even death. Most of the time, it's just things like burnout. You have another opportunity. Your focus is going elsewhere. And you don't see that day coming, where in our office, we call it like one bad day, right? We'll talk to a lot of sellers or a lot of business owners that become sellers, and we'll say, when are you ready to sell? They'll be like, oh, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And then they have one bad day and they're done. Right. So we don't know that. So I'd estimate 95% of all businesses are sold not according to a timeline or a plan. And the trigger's just pulled after that one bad day. Right.
Wow, that's a great insight. And so, and I cut you off. You were going to go to #2. So #1 is options. Love that.
So
And have those
options.
even for our listeners out there, even before you're contemplating selling, be looking already at the options. Do I have that right?
Yes, I'd say the best time to identify your exit options is the first day you start your business. The next best day, because most of us miss that. The next best day is today, right?
Okay.
Is just educating yourself around what options you do have to exit. Okay. So the second thing, practical tip really to prepare for sale, is to really have a good financial, healthy organization. So that means maintaining very good books and records, profit and loss statements, balance sheets. And when I say good books and records, it's not just, are you documenting these things? That's kind of like table stakes, right? You have to document your revenue, your expenses, things like that. But are you updating your books and records consistently? Monthly is the best. Are they consistent year to year? I'm working on a client's financials right now, and the categories change every single year. So if you're a buyer looking to buy this business, you have to do an intensive forensic due diligence just to figure out where the rent went one year from the next. And that happens, things just get messy. We don't want to keep too many personal expenses or non-essential expenses in the business. So a lot of things about financial health, but it's really the most important aspect when you go to sell a business, if that's the exit that you choose. And financial issues probably prevent most of the sales just because of different things that pop up.
Okay. All right. Beautiful. So they're your top 2 tips, would you say?
Yeah. Top 2. The last one I'd say is being an owner versus an operator in your business. So getting out of the operator role, making the business less about you. And I think that goes back actually, Cindy, to your mindset thing too, right? Because it's a little bit ego driven sometimes. So just removing yourself from the day-to-day operations of the business as much as you possibly can. It makes it a more sellable business. It makes it a more valuable business, but it also makes it a less risky business for you to own. So if something does happen to you, somebody can step in. If you want to take a 3-week no phone vacation, you actually will be able to. So that would be if I had to round out my top 3, that would be my third tip.
I love that. And I'm going to ask you to unpack a bit. I mean, a lot of our listeners may know the term, but I know for myself, even after, a couple of decades and more in business, it was probably about 4 years ago, the first time I heard that owner versus operator distinction. And it was like a total aha moment for me. I'm like, oh my gosh. So if you don't mind unpacking that for our listeners in case they don't know what that is.
Yeah. So an operator of the business basically has a job in the business. Yes, you own the business from a legal standpoint, but you're working in the business. You're doing any of the day-to-day activities, and that could range from selling the products, delivering the services, hiring the people. I always joke, operators are the chief revenue officer, chief HR officer, chief marketing officer. They're the chief janitor sometimes, right? They're
Absolutely.
doing it all. Jim Collins refers it to seats on the bus, right? What are the seats on your bus in your business, and how many of those are you occupying?
Yeah.
And if you're occupying, more than one, really, you are an operator in your business.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side, an owner of a business is basically the CEO role. You are managing the business. You're not managing the operations, the day-to-day things that happen in the business. You're looking at things like what is happening with your P&L? What is the value of your company? What are some strategic moves you can make? You're often interacting with your leadership team, but you're the owner of the business. And if you think about this, like publicly traded companies, if you're a stock holder or a shareholder in a company, you don't go in and, ask Facebook how their day-to-day operations are going, like, hey, can I help with some of the ad spend on this new client account? That's not what you're doing. If you're a stockholder, you own part of Facebook.
Yeah.
And really what you'd be doing if you're an active owner is you'd be reviewing financial statements and looking for trends and seeing how the business is doing and whether or not it's still a good investment for you to have in the future.
Yeah, nice. And I found that such an eye opener, right? A shift in how I looked at the business. And I know, like for myself, even as a lawyer, of course, you're getting a decent income, obviously, built this business, but it was that owner versus operator, the distinction where you're still trading time for money. Like if you stay in that operator mode, it doesn't matter how much you charge, you're still constantly trading time for money. And it was a real shift to step back. And if we spend too much time operating, you're not effectively acting as an owner at all, or managing the big picture of the business and setting it up. So I thought that was such a beautiful distinction. I'm glad you raised that. And why don't you share with us what are some of the most common mistakes that you find people make in selling a business, and what can they do to avoid them?
Yeah. The first most common mistake, and I feel like repeating myself a little bit here, is just the head in the stand strategy, not realizing that it is going to happen. I talk to a lot of people that will say, well, I don't plan to exit my business for 5 years, so I'm not going to work on the valuation until a year before. And one what that does is it delays it. And if something does happen in the future, then you're in the near future, less than 5 years, you're unable to sell. But also I see most of the time they never actually jump on that strategy. So that's the biggest, is not preparing. And that's why I founded Exit Factor. I saw way too many people not just able to sell, a lot of people that weren't able to complete the transaction, but people that left lots and lots of money on the table just because they didn't understand the process and they didn't take, and this is not an intensive thing. It's like dedicating maybe an hour a week. If you don't have an extra hour a week, maybe it's an hour of strategic planning time a month for the future planning of the company. So that's the biggest one. The second biggest one, I mentioned this earlier, is that ego play,
Yes.
right? So as we're starting businesses and we're founding them, they all are about us in the startup mode, right? And they have to be, because we're the chief everything, like I mentioned, like we're doing everything. And the business is reliant on us. And I think at some times, I know I've been guilty of this too, it does boost your ego to be in and doing things.
That's true.
And if you aren't able to let go of that when you go to sell your company, it causes a whole host of problems. Everything from that owner operator discussion we just had, all the way to like when you're talking to a buyer and they ask, who's the most important person that operates in your company? And the sellers will say, well, it's me, right? And they're like, well, okay, well, you're not staying. So how am I gonna
That's a problem.
that's the problem. So it is letting go of that ego, and tied to that ego is having adequate expectations. And I do use the metaphor of selling a house when you're selling a business, right? So if you love your home and you've poured your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and say, you decided you wanted a custom pink kitchen, right?
Yeah.
And you spent $250,000 on this custom pink kitchen, and you're talking to your realtor and you're like, I want $250,000 out of that. Plus I want the potential, because potentially this could be a story in Condé Nast or something like that. It could get me all this PR. So I want to get paid for that potential. It's similar with businesses. One big mistake I see owners make is that evaluation is actually, it is part art and part science. science, but it's a pretty straightforward formula. And it's very indicative of what the market is willing and not willing to pay for a company. So getting stuck in these expectations that are again tied to ego of what a company is worth, what I deserve for it, all of my hard work. Like we started the conversation. Yes, I get it. It is your baby, and it is sometimes hard to part with something, especially I don't know if there is any value you really could put on something that you founded and you grew and you nurtured over decades. But there is a way to put a value on it, and you just have to have the right expectations going into that process. As the third mistake, again tied to ego, is just getting stuck on a number because it's a number and it has no basis in fact or science, really.
Yeah, I love that. And as you were saying that, I tied to ego. I mean, definitely that ego is like the kiss of death in negotiations. And this totally would be a great example of that. But also, I guess the emotion, Jessica, right? Like when you bring that emotion, that emotional attachment to it, that emotional investment that you have in it. And if you can't get the distance, then that's going to step in and interfere. And I'd love if you could give us a few examples when you talked about you've seen countless cases where people just leave lots of money on the table. Can you give a few, or even, one or two illustrations for our listeners out there about what does that look like? What kind of ways do people leave money on the table?
Yeah. So ultimately, when you think about what a buyer is willing to pay for a business, they're going to look at of investment, and they're also going to look at the potential risk in the investment, right? And the riskier they see your company, the less they're willing to pay for it. It can affect any part of the business, but a big chunk of them come back to that financial health and that financial cleanliness issue that I talked about. And if we think about, we don't have clean books and records, they're not consistent year to year. The buyer is not just seeing those, I would call them inconsistencies, not necessarily errors in finances, but it's also putting this like red flag in their mind. Like, if this isn't clean, what else am I missing? What else is hiding in the company? Right. And usually when I see that too, and like I said, there's a whole host of issues just with finances. Sometimes we don't even know what we're spending our money on. Right.
Yeah.
So we'll have these expenses in our P&L, and ultimately, I don't think we'll have tons of time to jump into valuation today, but ultimately a business is valued as a multiple of its earnings or a multiple of its profitability. So if we don't know what are in those expense line items and we're spending money on who knows what things we don't need in our business, we're losing a multiple of value there too. So I see a lot of that. And I do see like another big one tied back to our ego and expectations, where people will structure deals. Like they'll accept a higher valuation. Say you have two buyers and one buyer comes in and says, I think your business is worth $5 million, but I'm only going to pay you 20% down. And then I'm going to tie the rest of the valuation to performance in future years. You're like, okay, that's a pretty good deal. And another buyer comes in and they say, well, I think your business is only worth $3 million, but I'm going to give you all $3 million today.
Yes.
And I see a lot of people go after the first deal, right? The $5 million deal, ego, expectations.
Yes.
They say, oh, I sold my business for 5 million. Well, no, because they only got 20% down. And then typically those future payments don't come, or if they do come, they don't come in full. I do see people leave a lot of money on the table where they're thinking they're getting more for their business, but actually like cash in their jeans, what they can spend, they're getting less.
Yeah. Oh, I'm cringing. I've been guilty of much of what you're talking about here. Where were you years ago? So good. And what are some things, and you may have touched already on some of this, but what are some things that you would suggest that people can or definitely should do to increase the likelihood of being able to sell their business? Like keeping your books clean, obviously, I get that. Anything else that you find people miss that would really just help them be able to sell their business more effectively?
Yeah. So I think, look, you said at the top of our time together, Cindy, that a lot of us are taught how to build companies, grow companies, but not a lot of us learn how to exit them. You are not going to be an exit in experts, right? Or an expert in exit, sorry. Most of us will only do this once, maybe twice in our lifetimes. There are people that buy and flip businesses. There are business flippers out there, but that's not the majority. So the first thing I usually recommend is have a business valuation and an exit assessment done for you. And what that does is it establishes what the company's worth, but also potential roadblocks into getting a deal done. And experts that do things like that, like my company does that, those are experts that work on hundreds of deals a year. So they know what they're looking for. And it will really open your eyes into what kind of holes you can plug in your business so you can avoid some of those mistakes that we talked about.
Yeah, that's great advice, actually. And it's funny, we have no issue getting coaches for athletics, just about any other art, but we don't think about getting coaching for our businesses. And it just makes such sense, both in the growing phases of the business and in the exit phases of the business as well. So now, obviously, negotiation plays a key role in selling a business. So what kind of tips do you have for us on how to best navigate those negotiations?
Yeah, negotiations is huge in selling a business, right? Like any other business deal or sales deal that you're going into. The one big piece of advice I have is that you're just not going to win every battle. And I think this goes for all negotiations is really, I call it pick your most important outcome. So what's most important to you and fight for that. You cannot win every single thing. So if you want to, and we have this conversation a lot with our clients, if you want to protect the legacy of your company, you want to protect your employees' jobs, their income, you might not also be able to get the highest price for the business. The highest price might come from a buyer who's going to lay people off and change the name and merge it into their company. So pick what that most important outcome is. And then another, like I've got two other ones. One big one that we talk a lot about is you don't have to be right. You have to just get what you want. So in negotiation, and this, I feel like ego is our recurring theme here. But I see people getting stuck in the need to be right or the need to win on certain topics and really keeping that end goal in mind that you're exiting, keeping that most important outcome in mind. That's what you want. You don't need or want to be right or to win every battle. And then, the last big thing, and I think this is in all negotiations, whether it's in business or personal life, one of my mentors told me about the 24-hour rule once. Are you familiar with that, Cindy?
Yeah.
Just if you get angry or you don't like the outcome, just wait 24 hours before you respond. Please don't hit the reply button on your email and fire off, a hot-headed email. Just take the 24 hours and calm down. Nothing, even in selling your business, is that urgent that you can't calm down for 24 hours before.
Yes. So good. And frankly, even in the moment when you're in a face-to-face, sometimes even taking 24 seconds can help, right? I mean, just take the pause, and
I mean,
regroup.
when I'm speaking to audiences, my speaking coaches always say like, hey, if you don't remember your next line or you need a break, just walk over and get a glass of water, right? Give yourself a break. And it's the same thing in negotiations. If you're in the room, like you're right, take 24 seconds, grab a glass of water, excuse yourself to the restroom, just take a break,
That pause, absolutely. Some great tips buried in there. Again, for our listeners, just want to really put a pin in that. Like, know your priorities, right? Like, set those priorities, know what you want, and prioritize which of them are the most important, and do that in advance of the negotiation. And I love that you touched on outcomes. I think so often, as you say, we get caught in the process, and especially because we're so conditioned to see negotiations as a competition. And, my whole mission is to reframe that, right? Like, be looking for the best outcomes. And that means knowing what the outcomes are that you're seeking, both in terms of the process, in terms of the relationship. Sometimes taking less in something for a longer term relationship might be worth it, right? I mean, you need to know who you're negotiating with. So great advice on all fronts. And one thing I'd be interested in, we're hearing more and more now that the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs are women these days. Do you see any gender differences in dealing with or negotiating to buy or sell a business?
Yes, I do a little bit. I mean, there's pros and cons to both. When we're dealing with men, they're much more competitive. So that get what you want. That's a big conversation we have over and over again, even with our team, right? So I do see that. I see a lot more emotional attachment and actually a lot more ego with the women business owners because they do form this emotional attachment to their business like it's their baby. And maybe that is because we're conditioned to be mothers and, that's easier for us to form that emotional attachment. So, and that plays into those ego, the expectations, things like that. When we have such a strong emotional attachment to something, it's often hard to be objective in a negotiation or a business dealing. And I think you're never going to set that emotional attachment aside, especially in a business negotiation. You're probably talking about maybe a year at the most in this process. It would take much longer than that to cut the cord, so to speak.
Yeah.
But just to be aware of it and be aware of how that's affecting your actions and being able to make the cognitive choice to set that emotional attachment aside.
Yeah. Okay. And we talked a bit about the reasons why, like the biggest mistakes people make, but I'd be interested to know, in your experience, what are some of the most likely reasons that you see the negotiations fail? Like, not because of, the business piece of it so much, but the actual negotiation process. What are some of the culprits that you see that cause failure in those negotiations?
Yeah. Third parties. So when we're selling a business and we're in the negotiation phase, there's a lot of third parties. So it's not just the buyer and the seller and the business broker or M&A advisor that are trying to put the deal together. We have to involve people like bankers and lawyers and CPAs and landlords. And so there's a lot of failure points in these different third parties that have different objectives. They often have different outcomes than what would be aligned with either the buyer or the seller. And so it's hard to control those people. So it's a major failure point, and it's a big grouping because it could be any one of those individuals or others. And really having someone that's capable of handling those third party relationships. It could be even like a third party in your business. It could be a silent investor or, something like that, a spouse. But that's the biggest failure point I see in the negotiation. Has nothing to do with buyer seller, right?
Yeah. Such a great point. And it's funny, all of the podcast, I haven't heard anybody mention that, like in negotiation generally, and you're so right. And I mean, it's something I'm hyper aware of, having been a lawyer for 30 years, right? I mean, it's why everybody hates us. I mean, you could take lawyers tank more great deals because we're so conditioned and taught to think of everything that could possibly go wrong. And you know what? I mean, sometimes there's got to be a certain leap of faith. So I love that you've raised that, because for our listeners out there, I think it's a great piece of advice as well. Choose your lawyer carefully, right? Choose your banking institution carefully. And particularly where there's service providers where you're choosing, be intentional about that, right? Like, don't get a lawyer, and don't forget you're the customer. So you tell them what you want. Like, hey, I don't want you being so over vigilant, like point out obvious errors to me here. And it reminds me, God, as you were saying that, when we first moved up north, we were buying our first, not moved up north, when we bought our first cottage, and we found this smoking hot deal. We didn't know that at the time, but we found this we figured it was a pretty good deal, but in hindsight, it was a smoking hot deal on this lakefront property up in a Muskoka premier cottage destination. We used a lawyer from the city, and he got his shorts all in the knot about this shore allowance on the property, and you can't buy it, you don't own the shore. Well, little did, and our real estate agent's trying to say, oh my God, like, trust me, this is like so common and normal. Sure enough, the entire deal fell apart, and it turned out that our lawyer was just being way hyper vigilant, and virtually nobody owned the shore allowance. You had to buy shore allowance. So we ended up losing it. That property's worth 10 times what we could have got it for. So great.
Yes. Yeah. And you actually, I love what you touched on too, there is, when you're searching for advisors and partners in these deals, specialists, right? So your lawyer wasn't a specialist in that market. And sometimes, and you know this as a lawyer, that there's different practice areas, right? So we joke all the time is like, you don't want your divorce attorney or your litigator to do your business transaction, right? And that goes for CPAs and bankers and things like that too, is that you really want somebody that understands what you're doing. And that's really when we see those third party issues, besides landlords who just never want to give in. There's actually the biggest challenge in the deal. The lawyers are not. But besides them, like, you want to find a specialist that knows how to do a business sale or transaction. And like I said, you don't need your litigator or your divorce because they're going to bring up different risks that probably aren't applicable to that transaction.
Yeah. And even within the specialties, as you're saying that, Jessica, like really niche down within that, because that guy, ours was a real estate. That's what he did. He was a real estate lawyer, but he was from the city versus being from cottage country, and different rules apply, right? So, and I'm sure the same applies with most businesses. Getting somebody who does sort of, being able to have exit sort of strategies or contracts around sale of businesses. But if you've got somebody whose experience is in the wrong industry, then you could be missing subtleties that are going to tank the deal for all the wrong reasons. So I love that. Such a great insight. And what do you see as some of the key hallmarks of a great negotiator? Like, in your experience doing so many of these deals all the time, what do you look for? What would you suggest to our listeners that they should be trying to up-level their skills in?
I think there is a condition of calm that really great negotiators have, right? They kind of stay steady. They don't get too excited. They don't get too distraught. They just stay steady. Typically, I also see great negotiators have a belief that the deal can come together if both parties can agree, but they don't stake their career or their retirement on this deal has to work, right? They know that deals can fall apart at any given time. And I think that ties into that state of calm and steadiness. And then also knowing, and this is like such a cliche in negotiations, but it is a give and take, and it's a win-win, right? And you can look at it either from the glass half full or glass half empty side. Like, I will say, like, both parties have to have a win, or it has to work for each party. My husband will say, a deal never comes together until each party is upset about something thing, right? So glass half full, glass half empty, but it's true. There is a balance. And I think great negotiators are aware that there is a balance and that competitive nature, which is, it's funny, it still exists because rarely, especially when we're in a market, a dynamic business market and global business market today, rarely do you have negotiations anymore where one party just crushes the other one. It's not a win for one and a loss for the other. There's a balance.
Yeah. So great. I mean, two things I want to really unpack there that you said that I think are so great. And one is not being so attached to the deal, right? I think that's such great advice. So I have over the years seen so many deals where people continue to bargain way after the point where it even makes sense for them anymore because they become so attached to the idea of that deal. And the opposite is true too, where people walk away from a great deal because they became attached to a particular version of that deal and didn't have the open-mindedness or flexibility to see that there's actually a better option lying right there on the table and you're blind to seeing it right now. So I think that's such great advice that you've given us. And we talked a little bit about preparation. What role would you say that preparation plays in effective negotiations for these exits?
I think preparation is all about the education side for these exits and the negotiation phase. You do have to have a level of understanding of how these deals come together, especially if you're on the other side of a table of a sophisticated buyer, right? So if it's your first business sale and you're across the table from the buyer that's buying a business for the first time, you're on equal playing fields, right? You both learning at the same time, and surrounding yourself with great advisors will help that. But sometimes you're going to be on this other side of the table from a buyer who's done 5, 10, hundreds of transactions. And you do put yourself at a disadvantage, even with the best advisors on your team, of just not knowing how this specialized practice of business comes across. And that's another reason why I wrote that book, was to give a little insight. But you do want to educate yourself, and that will help in your negotiations. That's the preparation side for the negotiation. So when a buyer does say, hey, I need you to retain, and this is just an example, I need you to retain a certain percentage in seller financing because my lender requires it, you don't kill the deal, right? Over that, because you're educated enough to know that in almost every transaction now that some form of seller financing is required. So, but I've seen deals blow up because of that. And really that's a standard operating procedure in small business transactions now, but the sellers were just not educated or aware of that aspect of it.
Yeah, that reminds me, as you're speaking about the financing piece, again, it goes back to what we were talking about choosing your providers, whether a lawyer. And I think a lot of people feel like they've got no choice in the banking. Like they go to their bank and that's it. And when times are getting tough, and we're seeing it again, banks are really like clamping down right now. We went to buy a property recently and we got a hassle from our bank on the mortgage. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, hello, do you see the assets? Like, what is happening? So recognizing that there are options and scoping out some of those options as well. And if you've got a bank that's not being flexible, don't be afraid to look at other alternatives to be maybe taking your business somewhere else, because there are alternatives there.
Very true. I also think it's important too, if you're in a negotiation like this, when you're selling your business or something else where there's a lot of other third parties, vet the other parties' partners too. So if you're in a situation, in a negotiation where you have multiple offers from buyers, often we'll ask to see what partners those buyers are planning to work with. And if we know there's a bank on the other side that's not lending right now, we're not going to go with that buyer unless they choose to change their partner, because we're going down a rabbit hole that there's no positive end there. So
great advice. Great advice. And I just wanted to circle back to this win-lose idea that you mentioned, because I think it's so critical when we come with, and it's the foundation of what's kicked me off on this art of feminine negotiation, the name of our podcast here. Because when we approach negotiations with that really competitive mindset where I want X and I'm so certain about that and you think you want Y, we miss the opportunity to be able to actually come up with better outcomes. And I think people assume that when you're selling a business, it's just the dollar amount. But I've seen some amazing deals come together where somebody's selling a business, but when they stayed open to the possibility, they took a little less on the business, but then it turned out they were moving across country. And this person was willing to look at an option where they could have sort of almost a mini franchise aspect of the business there. And that ended up being a way better outcome. So just again, not getting too attached and redefining negotiations as a collaborative attempt to get the best possible outcome rather than winning over the other party, which I think is a point you made so beautifully.
Yeah, I love that. You just reminded me one of my favorite deals we've ever done. And the seller was in that mindset of the most important outcome and not winning. But his outcome was that he wanted to move out of business and into real estate management. So he wanted to have a number of vacation rental properties in different locations across, it was Colorado was the deal. So he couldn't find a buyer for the business, couldn't find a buyer. Nobody was willing to offer him what he wanted. Finally, we have a buyer that came to the table. We're sitting in the negotiation room and the buyer said, you know what? I don't have the cash to give you the money that you want for the business because it's tied up in my vacation rental properties. So we ended up doing a swap. So the buyer took the business and in trade, the seller got a number of the buyer's properties, which was the outcome he wanted anyway. And it was just one of my favorite deals because both parties sat in that room. They worked through the negotiations in a creative mindset, focused on the outcome and not the numbers of the deal. Right.
Oh, how beautiful is that? How beautiful
Yeah.
is that? And tied to that, I think when you come with that, as you say, creative mindset, which I love, we're so conditioned to hold our cards really close to our chest, right? Like it's a giant
Yeah.
poker game. Don't give up anything because that's a sign of weakness and blah, blah, blah. And in my experience, and I used to buy into that, to be honest, at the beginning, my clients called me the Barracuda. You may have heard me say it, and then I had my epiphany. It's the more open and transparent you are about what the real needs are, open exactly those kind. Had they held their cards close to their chest, they would never have been able to come to that outcome. So
No, if the buyer had never said, I don't have the money because of this, right? Or if the seller never said, well, I really just want to exit because I want to
yeah.
manage a bunch of yeah, you're totally right. So,
That's so good. So good. Oh, this has been such great advice you've given us. And you've given me loads to think about because I have not put any of these steps in place. And as you were talking about some of the things, I'm like, oh, my books aren't as clean as they should be. Guilty as charged. Knowing where the expenses are going, but putting some of that personal stuff through, guilty as charged. Having an expert on board to help you through the process. So I some great advice. And I normally like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've ever had in your life? It doesn't have to be on this, it can be on anything, but where you have an aha moment that makes you show up differently.
I'll go personal on this one. And mine is really, I mentioned I have a 10-month-old. So I've become a mother for the first time later in life for me. So I'm in my late 30s.
Congrats.
And thank you. So that was the mindset shift for me was that work provides me life, not
Oh,
takes away from my life because my life is really now about my family and giving my son a great environment to grow up in. And before I just, worked all the time. So it's a huge mindset shift of keeping a schedule and hours and prioritizing him over work.
yes.
That's been a big shift for me.
Oh, and that's a beautiful reminder for all of us. And I think COVID has also really escalated that learning curve for many of us when we realize just how fragile life is. And, very few people on their deathbed go, geez, I wish I had worked more and spent less time with my family, right? And yet we
Right.
get it so wrong so often because we're so conditioned to be those cogs in the big corporate wheel. So thank you for that reminder. That was beautiful. So Jessica, tell people where they can find your book and where they can reach out to you if they're looking for somebody to help them with their exit strategy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cindy. So we've made it super easy. If you go to exitfactor.com/podcast, there's a link to the book. There's a link to a free resource. And you can also reach out to us on a form there or through social media.
Awesome. Awesome. And we'll make sure to throw that in the show notes as well. And again, obviously you've heard here that for any of you who have a business or are looking into a business, getting an expert, so important to be able to manage that process. So please do reach out to Jessica if you're looking for that kind of help. And I know I got tons of value from this. I got, you probably saw me moving over here, writing down notes on the side every once in a while of things that I know I have to do. And I'm sure you got loads of value as well. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. Feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you are so inclined. But most importantly, share, give the gift of sharing to people who you think could benefit from this message. And if you haven't heard yet, my new book, Art of Feminine Negotiation, is hot off the press, just hit Amazon bestseller status in multiple categories. So you can check that out at artoffemininenegotiationbook.com. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.